All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in the second installment of our lecture series on ancient China. We're going to begin first with a discussion of the Qin dynasty from 221 to 207 BCE, a fairly short-lived dynasty, but very important in the overall historical development of East Asian history. Of course, it gives its name, actually, to China. One thing that should be mentioned prior to this is that we do talk about regional Chinese kingdoms or dynasties prior to this time. The Shang dynasty, for instance, a North Chinese kingdom that developed along the Yellow River, and then the successor to that, the Zhou dynasty, which ruled China for several hundred years prior to the Qin. Shi Huangdi, which literally means first emperor, was, as it suggests, the first emperor of this united Chinese state. That really goes very far to cement not only those traditionally northern Chinese, early Chinese dynasties, but also begins to weld to that uh, more of what we would today call southern China or southeastern China. The Qin emerge out of a period called the Warring States. This was when there were, in the late Zhou dynasty, there were several kingdoms all battling each other in a kind of a Chinese version of feudalism. Out of that emerges a unified state. The one of those small kingdoms, the Qin, go on and sort of conquer and unify those other kingdoms. The administrator who's responsible for this is Li Se, who's the sort of the right hand man of the Emperor Qin. What Li Se does is he exploits a large peasant population for service in the army. So he's able to mobilize the sheer numbers of the Chinese population. This is what makes the Qin state so important. During the Qin period, they worked at land reclamation, irrigation. This made the Qin state very centralized and very efficient in organizing basically East Asia, for all intents and purposes. The Qin opposed some traditional elements of Confucianism. Confucianism was really very popular among the Zhou. That was that very, as you heard in the earlier lecture, very paternalistic. It organized the society in all these relationships and so on and so forth. It tended to be hierarchical, with the emperor being a sort of father figure ruling his family. Qin wanted to really have nothing to do with that. He preferred instead a more legalistic structure in which there was law, and all that a judge had to do was adjudicate whether or not someone had broken the law. If someone broke the law, then there was a prescribed punishment for it. Judges did not have the ability to actually go and determine what a suitable punishment would be. Instead, it was just simply, you broke the law, this is the punishment that goes with it, period, end of subject. This creates, therefore, a less benevolent, a less kind-hearted state, and one that is much more centralized, we would say totalitarian, in which the emperor and the imperial government have sort of total control uh, over all sectors of the Chinese society and economy. We can see here the extent of the Qin state. Those earlier dynasties had ruled only this area up here. There were other Chinese kingdoms elsewhere. The Qin really begin to unify what we would today call most of eastern China. You can see the outline here of present-day China, and you can see where the dense population in the east is ruled by the Qin at a very early stage. Some of the elements of establishing centralized authority. In other words, that the central government, the single government of all China, now has a great deal of power and authority. It's not dispersed out among local rulers, but it's very centralized. Compare this to the government of the United States, where you have a central government in Washington, D.C., You have a fair amount of authority in the states, and then within each state, you have counties that have certain responsibilities, and you have local municipalities that really, for all intents and purposes, govern our daily lives, establishing zoning ordinances, policies for how you get dog tags for your animals and cats and dogs and so forth. In China, it's going to be much more centralized. Rules, orders, laws are going to come really from that national government, if you want to call it. All right. In order to establish that kind of authority, one of the first things that Qin had to do was go after the landowners, the aristocracy. These are the people who typically supported local government as opposed to a national government. Um, Qin abolishes the privileges of primogeniture. That's the ability to have estates pass intact to one male heir. What this did was allowed these aristocratic families to remain very, very powerful. One, one heir would be able to inherit all of this land and all of this wealth intact, and remain a fairly independent, wealthy power in and of themselves. If you abolish that rule and you say that an estate can be distributed or has to be distributed among all of the potential heirs of a landowner, now all of a sudden you have much smaller farms, and the power base now, the power that each one of those smaller landowners can muster is significantly less than if all that land and wealth and so forth were in the hands of one heir. Qin abolishes slavery, making free peasants now available to imperial service and the imperial government, as well as public works and so on. Thus, the building of the Great Wall of China, or pieces of the Great Wall of China, will begin under Qin, will be continued under the Han, and so forth. Um, this issue also takes that free peasantry now, which is kind of indebted to the central government for freeing them from slavery from the local aristocracy. Now the local peasants, are a way around the local aristocratic power bases. The peasantry now is really very much allied to that central government. So that's the way in which Qin is able to really break the power of the traditional aristocracy that had engaged in that constant warring among those little petty Chinese kingdoms that we know as the Warring States period. Other things that Qin does is an issue of standardization. Now that you've created a single centralized government, it's a question of making sure that there are policies that are consistent throughout the empire. Weights and measures. So you don't go from one region to another and have a different way of measuring things. Or a different, a pound is 10 ounces in the north, and then you go 150 miles to the west, and now all of a sudden a pound is 12 ounces, and you travel further south and it's 16 ounces, and so forth and so on. You standardize weights and measures so that when you talk about a pound, that's a universal unit of measurement. Coinage, the same thing. You're not traveling. Imagine if you were traveling from New Jersey to Pennsylvania, and all of a sudden you had to uh, you had to go to a currency exchange office because Pennsylvania had different money, and if you had New Jersey money, you couldn't buy anything in Pennsylvania. So you standardized coinage throughout the empire. The width of axle wheels. This sounds sort of silly, but that allows for roads to be made to a standard size. Imagine today if every car had a different width, and there were some really, really super wide cars. Now all of a sudden they wouldn't be able to fit on the roads that we have today. You'd have to make much, much wider roads. So standardizing axle wheels was quite important. This also happened in the United States in the time of the railroads. Different railroads had different gauge track, different width track. So that meant that if you were traveling on a long distance train, let's say from New York to Chicago, you'd have to use several different train companies, um, rail companies, as you went. One train could not travel on all those different tracks. you'd actually have to go from one station, change your train, get on another train, so because that train was designed for and built for that specific gauge track, you would travel out that, go to another station, you'd have to change trains again, and so forth, because nothing was standardized. Now you could have a fast train, a direct train from New York to Chicago, because all of the train tracks are standardized around the United States. Okay. Law codes are the same. They're uniform throughout the country. Right? Common system of writing goes without saying. What a disaster that would be is if there were, different ways of writing the English language throughout the United States. Built lots of roads and started constructing pieces of the Great Wall, linking earlier sections that had been built by earlier dynasties and so forth. The Great Wall is ostensibly designed as a barrier against the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. In reality, it's more of a spine around which defense can be made. It's certainly no fail-safe. It's certainly very persistent nomadic horse tribes from Central Asia can find ways around the Great Wall, even when it was finally completed and was relatively contiguous. Now we're going to turn our attention to the Han Dynasty, a continuation in many ways of Qin policies. The Han Dynasty lasts from about 206 BCE to 220 CE. This is roughly around the same period of time that we talk about the Rome from the era of the Punic Wars or so, all the way to the crisis of the 3rd century. And here's that great comparison, at either end of the Eurasian landmass, where we see the Roman Republic and Empire growing, flourishing, and facing great difficulty in the middle of the 3rd century, and another empire in the Far East experiencing the same kind of difficulties in around the same time period. The issue, of course, with the Han Dynasty is that it will collapse. The Han Dynasty will give way in the 3rd century. Rome, under a succession of reforming emperors, notably Diocletian and then Constantine, is able to weather the storms of the 3rd century and give the Roman Empire another roughly 200 years of longevity. The Han kept many of the same traditions that were established under the Qin. This goes really with the sense of centralization, consolidation, standardization, all of those issues. The Han do not give up on any of those things. So centralized, standardized imperial control is going to be a hallmark of the Han as well. Areas where they actually backed off a little bit on the Han. One thing that the Han was that backed off on things that the Qin did. One thing that was very unpopular was the reliance on legalism. So the laws were made a little less harsh, and Confucian principles, that traditional policy, were to some extent reinforced during Han rule. So there is a little bit of a change there. Government there was a stress on the benevolence of the government working on the good for all people. Hierarchy was also stressed during this period, and those are all things that go along with those Confucian principles that experience a revival under the Han. The Han are also very much known for their expansion of Chinese culture, not only in East Asia, but now beginning to stretch out increasingly more into Central Asia. The Han are really an ethnic group, and a very dominant ethnic group in East Asia. For us to say that there is simply Chinese, that Chinese is a single ethnic group, that's a difficult proposition to uphold, especially the further back in history you go. One has to realize that in the ancient world, for a geographic area as large as what we would today consider as China, there were multiple ethnic groups that were very, very closely related to one another. And to some extent, we can see this in parts of Western Europe even today. The relationship between the French and the Spanish and the Italians. It's a family of languages that are fairly closely related to one another. And there are similar cultural practices, there are similar religious issues. You could theoretically see a kind of super European kingdom consisting of Spain and Italy and France. And at various times in European history, pieces of those kingdoms were actually all joined to one another. But there are serious cultural differences, nevertheless, linguistic differences and so on, between French and Italians and Spanish. That's similar to the kinds of issues that you see in the different regions of China. One notable example that's still quite prevalent today is the difference between Mandarin Chinese, which is spoken by something on the order of 90% of the Chinese population, and Cantonese, which is a very different dialect of China, of Chinese language, and yet the Cantonese are still part of the modern Chinese state. Under the Emperor Wu, the Han continued to expand after it had consolidated eastern China, expanded south as far as present-day Vietnam. Also under Wu, they began attacks into Manchuria and Korea to the north, and finally, and most importantly, extending their influence out into Central Asia along the so-called Silk Road. And this is really what makes China a kind of transforms China from a regional kingdom into what we might call at this early stage of history a global empire on a similar footing, if not even greater footing, in terms of its influence than that of ancient Rome. China tended to be much more connected to the peoples of Southeast Asia and India in a way where we see that Rome tends to be a little bit more isolated. There are some scholars who look at Rome as being much more the periphery, the margins of the trade routes in the ancient world, was not as integrated into it as China and India and parts of Southeast Asia were, and even parts of the east coast of Africa uh, and the Middle East. These were all core areas of the ancient trade routes around the Indian Ocean and in Central Asia. Rome tends to be a little bit more off the beaten path. China is kind of at the very heart of ancient trade. Here we can see the Han state and how it expands on the Qin base in East Asia here and expands to the south, up into the north, and then the great expansion out into the west. This will be China's most tenuous hold of all these regions that it conquers. The core areas will still always be in here. This will be an extension that will be hard to defend and will occasionally fall to other Central Asian nomadic empires. Han rulers, in terms of their government, tended to still oppose aristocracy. They instead allied themselves with sort of the leaders of the peasantry, what we call the rural gentry, those wealthy peasant farmers who tended to be very influential in very local matters. These are the folks that the Han relied on to institute their government, rather than large land-owning, fairly independent aristocrats. Those folks tended to oppose the power of the central government. So that's where Han really finds its power base. They relied on the gentry entering into civil service, and we can see a comparison to ancient Rome as well. Augustus, the Emperor Augustus, really tended to rely not on the old patrician families, but on the equites, the equestrian class of the plebeians, to fill the ranks of the civil service, thus raising their status. We can also talk about the Han period as constituting the Peace of China, the Pax Sinica, directly comparable to the Pax Romana, that we see from roughly the age of Augustus to the end of the period of the five good emperors, ending with Marcus Aurelius around the year 180. China has a similar period of peace and prosperity, even at around the same time. The civil service in Han China was again dominated by this gentry class, the sort of wealthy peasants. This kind of civil service should be entered by examination. So it's not something that should go to people who are simply connected, that are sons of wealthy, noble families. Instead, they should be people who are highly educated, that know how the bureaucracy works, and not only that, but they are highly trained, and they have the know-it-all and wherewithal to carry out their duties. This also created a kind of meritocracy, meaning that anyone who had the know-how, anyone who could pass the civil service exams, could enter into these government positions, no matter who you were, no matter what part of the country you were born in, no matter what class you were born to, or what family you were born to, you could enter into government service. Those who were dissatisfied with this system, which is very Confucian, tended towards a more Taoist ideology, where the people are just ruled by a kind of benign or benevolent government. Refer back to the earlier lecture on the implications of Taoism for government. With the great expansion, especially into Central Asia, as well into Southeast Asia, China's trade really takes off. And much of that expansion, the rationale for that expansion is increasing its access to other markets for Chinese goods, most notably silks and porcelains. The military need also interfaces with the need for trade, which is infrastructure, particularly roads. So the military needs roads, and these same roads will also now be used by caravan traders going to the east and coming from the east and so on, thus making trade all the more important. As trade becomes more important, protecting those trade routes becomes more important, and therefore the military presence out on the trade routes becomes more important. So these things sort of feed off of each other, and there's a bit of cross-fertilization of purposes back and forth. Not only transportation, but also communication. So courier systems, getting information back to the central government as quickly as possible, especially if there are indeed military threats on the frontiers. And with the increasing number of markets that are being opened along the trade routes, this is then in turn going to further stimulate one of the most important Chinese industries at this time, which was in silk cloth. Thus the name the Silk Road. Technologically speaking, around 500 BCE, China began to shift away from the use of bronze tools, which had been the traditional material of choice from the Shang period all the way down through the Zhou. In the late Zhou period, we start to see the increasing use of iron weapons. Okay? In the great burial chamber of the Emperor Qin, where there's all these terracotta soldiers, very famous archaeological discovery in the, at this point, what I think early 80s or late 80s. Many iron weapons were found in the hands, or steel weapons were found in the hands of these soldiers, swords and crossbows and so forth. Chinese worked iron with a higher amount of carbon, thus that's steel. Very, very pure iron is actually quite brittle. So if you remove all of the impurities from iron ore, you get something more like cast iron, which is actually quite weak and susceptible to corrosion. But through a process by which you reintroduce very carefully a small amount of carbon, this actually hardens it and creates what we would call steel, or an early form of steel. Chinese also developed the horse collar Um, the two animals that are most often used in agricultural production are either teams of horses or oxen. Oxen can be used because they're very, very strong and they can pull plows very, very easily. The problem is oxen tend to be a lot slower. So you could use a horse. Well, that increases your speed, but horses are not quite as strong as oxen. And particularly, it depends on where you put in terms of the physiology of these animals, where you actually put the collar on the horse. If you put the collar around the horse's neck and they're pulling a heavy plow, you're going to choke the horse. So what the horse collar does is this innovation where it actually distributes the pull load down more towards the horse's, what we might call the horse's chest, the lower front of the horse. And therefore allows teams of horses to pull more efficiently and heavy loads more quickly. That's a major step forward in agricultural production. Other technologies include paper, okay, taking wood pulp and fashioning it into paper, and the water mill as a primitive power source to harness, as we today harness the power of wind. Then you would put established mills on the sides of rivers to usually to grind wheat, grains, so forth and so on. The Han decline and fall. The cost of defending the frontier against the nomadic confederations, the horse tribes of Central Asia, began to take its toll on the Han economy. That's one issue. The second issue is one that's really quite complex. In order to defend against the nomads of Central Asia, okay, these vast grasslands on the northern and western frontiers of China, you need to have your own cavalry. You need to have access to war horses. That sometimes means that you make alliances with friendly nomadic tribes. Of course, sometimes friendly nomadic tribes can go over to the unfriendly column as well very quickly, and this causes a problem for Chinese military defense. Because the minute the Chinese begin to lose control over pasture land and access to the supply of horses, they have a diminished cavalry. That means that they are even in a weaker position to defend against further attacks by these nomadic horse confederations out on the plains. The more those horse nomadic confederations gain access and influence over pasture land, the weaker and weaker China becomes. Okay? The less able it is to defend itself. Another key issue, nobles increasingly started to re-exert influence over their peasants, reducing military manpower at a time when it's most needed, and reducing tax revenue at a time when the costs of defending the frontiers are ever increasing. Regional and aristocratic factions begin to emerge in the late Han period. That's kind of a return of the old warring states period that preceded the Qin. The central government was accused of corruption. Many folks just simply assumed that it would be better to hand power back over to these local governments or local aristocratic rulers for protection purposes. If the central government could not protect you from the bad guys over the hill, then maybe the local aristocrat could, the local landowner could. And then finally, there were peasant uprisings. There was banditry, lawlessness out in the local regions farther away from the central government. The central government could simply not afford to police anymore. So all these factors combine to bring down the Han Dynasty and create a period of relative instability until we see the rise of the Tang beginning in the 7th century. For now, however, these are some of the considerations for Han rise and fall, and I think it's very well worth our consideration at this point to make a comparison between those factors that led to the rise the rise and fall of the Roman Empire in Western Eurasia as well as the rise and fall of the Chinese Empire under both the Qin and Han in Eastern Eurasia. For now, however, thank you very much for listening.